Hello and welcome back to MLQ Replay. We have a very special episode this week. It's all about North Division. We've got North Division championships. We have an important decision coming out of the North Division, and we have some great interviews as well. As always, myself, Nick Jablonski, and Jack McGovern are here to break it all down. And with how much content we have to get to, I really think we just need to get into it this weekend. Obviously, North Division, a lot was decided. First of all, we needed a division champion, and Chicago did that convincingly, beating Toronto 240-95 and 240-115 back-to-back games to take that down. But then we also needed two other teams to join those two in the MLQ championship from the North. The first one to earn it was Minneapolis, beating Rochester 250-75 and 165-90 in a much closer game, too. But the fourth team who had to do it really had to do it the hard way. Detroit on Saturday had to take on Cleveland in a winner go-home matchup that went to a third game that went to game point next goal wins before Detroit could take it down. And then they'd come back on Sunday and beat Rochester 175-100 and 160-80 to effectively qualify. So let's start with the championship of the division itself with that Toronto versus Chicago matchup. Quite a one-sided one. Jack, it was a really impressive showing from the Prowl. What a performance.
Yeah, just more of the same. I mean, this team, whoever they've played against, they've had the answer. The pace that they've played with all season has set the tone in all their games. They've come out firing on all cylinders. They're just playing with so much chemistry. They're a really deep team. I mean, they look 3 or 4 lines deep in both the chaser and the beater game. Just across the board, a performance that should put the rest of the league on notice.
Yeah, and Nick, we've kind of been talking about the extreme pace that Chicago's been playing with on offense all season, but in this series, they were kind of bringing it on defense as well. I mean, they were happy to press basically as soon as they're crossing, not half field, basically the keeper's own line for a lot of these games. I mean, that's the only way you score 18 goals in 20 minutes in both games. So what do you think about the way kind of Chicago came out and played defense in the series? Is it something they can actually replicate in, late matchups at MLQ Championship?
I love it. I think it's so fun. We talk about teams wanting to play to this rule set, right? Ethan, you and I both thought that this year was going to be the year of presses. And it's really New York, Chicago, and Austin who are coming out and playing confidently with this pressing mentality. I think if you're talking about late game matchups, I think all 3 of those teams are going to struggle to play this at a high level in those late day 2 matchups for sure. Strictly because, Jack, you talk about 3-4 lines deep, right? I think the Chicago team is 3-4 lines deep against competition like this. To an extent, I think come semifinals, right? I think whenever those teams hit, right? Whenever New York, Austin, and Chicago hit, you're going to see cut down to the top 2 lines. And at that point, right, it's just hard to run a pressing structure when you have to go to this extent to play basically the entirety of the field.
Jack, do you want to push that back on that at all? Because I feel like some of these teams have kind of made it part of their identity. I mean, we were talking about Washington last week. We were talking about Chicago this week. There's something to be said about just kind of hitting the team over the head with your depth.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to push back on that. I think, that might have been a fair critique at the beginning of the season, but I think I saw some really encouraging signs from the depth of the Chicago Prowl this week, whether it's Lauren Smith, whether it's Nivas Jairam coming out of World Cup playing with a ton of confidence. This team has players, Grant Himmelman getting big minutes for the first time this season. This team has players who are ready to step up and ready to go to the next level if given the chance. So I'm just excited to see what they can do on a bigger stage.
Yeah, and you talk about people, coming out hot from World Cup, and we already talked, I think, about in the last Chicago series about Matt Brown coming back from time at Team USA. I mean, Matt Brown, I think everyone knows what Matt Brown's bringing to the table at this point, but I mean, I think in some ways in this series, he was kind of doing his best Max Havlin or Jackson Johnson, impersonation in terms of the high press. What did you see from Matt this weekend, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I saw a player who was confident in, and we talk about, right, the depth of this team at this level. You really are only able to play with the confidence and the pace that Matt Brown was able to play with this weekend, if you are confident that your beaters behind you can take over like this. We have seen these dominant beaters play at this tempo when they trust that the beating behind them can step up and stay solid. And I think Matt Brown is just out there at some points toying with his food at some level, right? Like he's just seeing how far up the field he can be, what awkward angles can he play at, where can he engage in weird scenarios. Sort of some of the stuff we saw Max Havlin do kind of in that Cup 8, Cup 9, Cup 10, just absolute like blazing hot run that we saw back then.
So, Jack, I feel like, to some degree, we always have to be cautiously optimistic, right? Because, we've seen this before. We've seen the undefeated North Division Championship just go into a quarterfinal before, and the result kind of not being what we've seen all season. So we're looking critically at the Chicago team. If there's anything from these games that's giving you pause, what would you say it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is. It's the seeking game. This team, I don't think has a clear answer at seeker yet. Noyes Oshra came through big time at USQ Cup for Boom Train, but we haven't seen that type of production. And if Chicago is going to be needing a flag runner catch in every game, or down a flag runner catch, that's a big hole to be working out of against some of the better teams who have more established answers at seeker. So yeah, I would be concerned about that if I were the Prowl.
Yeah, just one grab in 8 games this season. But obviously, I think one thing we can say positively about Chicago in that regard is we have really like what we've seen from the flag runner on pitch game in terms of creating points in the quadball game. Nick, any other concerns that you could kind of visualize about this Chicago team going into really big games at championships?
Yeah, I don't love the way they ended either game 1 or game 2. I thought they had a lot of possessions to end both of those games. And at some point, right, if we're gonna laud this depth and say that it is spectacular and it is a really, really deep team, you need to be ending goals, game-ending goals, no matter who's on the field at a certain point, right? It could come down to this team is in a finals matchup and players are hurt or injured who are your starting line, and it's going to come down to the second or third string to end this system. It seemed like they didn't really have an idea of what they wanted to do, and whether they're just hiding this, because on every other aspect of this game, this team is so well drilled, whether they're just like hiding their secret game-ending play in these blowouts, or they just don't have it, I'm a little worried. And if you give the elite teams chances to crawl back in or to maybe get the game-winning goal themselves, you're going to run into issues for sure.
And across the pitch, talking about this Toronto team, obviously come up short here, but still the most successful season this program has had, making it to finals North Division. They'll be making their first quarterfinals when they play in them in a couple weeks at MLQ Championship. We've seen this kind of before, where a Canadian team kind of runs up against that top tier American beating, and sometimes things get very, very difficult for them. But Jack, what did you like from this Toronto team that you've seen either this season or in this game?
Yeah, I thought the pair of Zach McDonald and Emma Sherwood were able to draw the opposing beaters out of position a couple times, and the Toronto offense, like with the beaters out of the play, were pretty effective at breaking like a high press at times. So yeah, I think they have a couple players who can beat defenders one-on-one. Levi Medeiros continues to work magic in every part of the pitch. Just love watching him play. But yeah, I think obviously Toronto struggled this weekend, and they'll want to put together a much stronger performance at MLQ Championships.
Yeah, so Nick, obviously not a ton of time to rebrand everything, but if you're Toronto or if you're coaching Toronto, what couple of things are you really hoping to drill into the ground before championship if they're going to hang a little bit better in a game against what's inevitably going to be a very good team?
Yeah, I think it's tough, right? Because my biggest thing is this is a team that looks like it needs to get up to speed. And one of the toughest things about coming into these quarterfinal matchups as a quote unquote favorite, as in winning one of these top 2 seeds from these divisions, is that you don't get the chance to warm into games, right? You don't get the chance to come in. You have to come in cold. So I think that if anything, it's going to be figuring out like, okay, how do we put ourselves in the best possible scenario to come into these games ready to play? Because once this Toronto team took that first hit from this Chicago team, they sort of came up with these ideas and they started to figure things out and figure out ways to slow the game down and not let themselves get pressured nearly as aggressively. And then they figured out the press break and everything there. So I think that realistically, whatever happens, they need to be able to come into these games ready to play from the very first minute.
Yeah, I think, one, shining light to kind of talk about here is Corey Smithson and what they've been doing in the flag runner game. I mean, we talked about how it's a big question mark in Chicago. In Toronto, there's not a question mark at all. I think for 2 seasons now, we've seen so much good out of Smithson in the flag runner game, and probably doesn't get spoken enough amongst, the top seekers in the league. Definitely deserves it. Not going to tie Ryan Davis in the end for runner catches, but that's because, Smithson played 4 less regular season games than Davis. So, still going to tie for second, I believe, with TJ Jennerett. So impressive there. And, we talked about how you can't be spotting good teams 35 points. It also helps, for your chances to spring an upset if you're giving yourself those 35 points. So definitely something to be there. And, we talked about Zach McDonald finally coming back into this program. If he and Evan Sherwood can create some space, let Smithson work, in one of these matchups. Probably getting into matchup, we don't know exactly who they're playing yet, but a matchup where, I don't think it's going to be a team that's beating is going to overwhelm this Toronto team, because we're basically looking at it's Washington or San Antonio. Probably, 2 of the better ways things could have fallen. I think if you're thinking about the East, Toronto would probably rather see a Washington than a Boston. I think at this point. I mean, you can disagree with me, but so I think, some things have kind of ticked Toronto's way, and it'll be interesting to see. I mean, like I said, it's a fun team to watch. I think it's a team that's kind of growing into this season. And, we'll kind of see how things go. Anything either of you want to add about the series before we get into our first interview? Awesome. So we're going to bring in head coach of the Chicago Prowl, Kennedy Murphy. Kennedy, thanks again for joining us this season.
Yeah, thank you.
So you kind of heard us talking about how we've kind of loved the way you guys have pushed the pace on offense all season, but this week it was defense as well. It was that really high press. It was really aggressive. Was that something you guys have kind of been building into at practice and we're just finally ready to implement, or was that something you specifically saw in this matchup that you kind of wanted to attack?
No, that's been something we've been working on all season, and even previously in the boom train season, carrying that over. Just more of an emphasis of doing that at all times during the game instead of just, when you feel like it.
Yeah, for sure. Now, obviously, this is the first undefeated season in program history, a long and proud program history. So what, if anything, does that mean to the team? What does it mean to you?
I think it's a nice way to finish up the regular season. We're definitely proud of it. But we right after the games ended, I said, "Good job. I'm proud of you. Let's do it again in 2 weeks."
Awesome. So we'll kind of move on to start talking about the decision, because I think it's like what a lot of people want to hear and what will inevitably finish setting up our MLQ championship bracket. So kind of tell me about some of the things you and your staff were considering while making this decision between Washington and San Antonio.
Well, we did look at, how we would match up against either of those teams. But further than that, we're not just considering the first matchup that we'll have in the bracket. We're looking at every single team and ultimately who we'll be looking at in the finals.
So I want to kind of touch on that then, because you mentioned kind of who you'll be seeing the entire way. Obviously, if you're trying to avoid a team, either way, you'll see them eventually if your goal is to win the whole thing. So how much did a potential semifinal matchup weigh versus a potential quarterfinal matchup?
Pretty heavily. Yeah, I'll say that I wasn't looking too much into what that first game would be, more looking long-term.
Fair enough. In that first game, though, there's obviously one team in San Antonio that your program has a lot of recent history with, and not necessarily pretty recent history. And then you have a team in Washington who, I mean, I think maybe if we go all the way back to early MLQ, there's a little bit of it, but these 2 teams have not played each other very much. So did that play into at all to the factors you were considering?
Maybe a little bit. I've never played Washington. I've played San Antonio twice. So there's a little bit of, that personal decision But if you look at the team compared to 2019 when San Antonio was first introduced into the league, and now our team has had so much turnover and new people coming in for the summer. So that didn't necessarily have a big factor in the decision.
Awesome. Well, we won't let the drum roll go any longer. So, Kennedy, let us know who Chicago Proud will be choosing to play in the quarterfinals.
We've selected San Antonio. I'm very excited personally to match up with them again for the third time.
Yeah, awesome. So
And
it'll be the
hopefully get
third
past
matchup in, I believe, 4 seasons of MLQ in that quarterfinal round. So it should be exciting. You don't have to go into too much detail, but really quickly, what kind of advantages do you kind of see in San Antonio that made you pick them? And then what also do you kind of respect about this team from what you've seen so far this season?
Yeah. I think in the past, what has been difficult for us matching up against San Antonio is their speed. And I think we've caught up and maybe even surpassed them in our overall team speed and our level of pressure on offense and defense. But that's still something I really respect out of them. Logan Zahn joined our team, Indianapolis Intensity, in 2021, and he brought a lot of those San Antonio, Texas ideas and that we've ultimately implemented into our team. So I think we are more similar than not at this point.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time. Thank you for making the decision. I think we're all now extremely excited for this quarterfinal matchup, and we'll look forward to watching you guys play in it. Best of luck.
Thank you.
All right, so before we jump into the other 2 series, just a quick conversation about this decision, kind of what it means for the bracket. So hopefully you have the bracket up on your screen now if our producer, Harry Clark, is hitting his cues. And so basically Chicago will now slot in 2 playing San Antonio on the New York side of the bracket. New York will be matched up with one of the 2 playing teams coming in. And then on the other side of the bracket, Austin will be playing one of the playing teams, and it'll be Washington playing against Toronto. Jack, I think we kind of all said that this decision we thought would make the most sense for Chicago. Has anything changed about that for you, or would you still agree that that's the decision?
No, I would agree. But yeah, interested in the semifinal aspect of the decision. The interest that Chicago seemingly had in playing New York over Austin.
Yeah. So, Nick, what do you make of that potential interest and that concept? What do you think about Chicago's potential matchups against either of those teams?
I think either way, it's going to be it would be fireworks, right? I think they're just I don't want to say they're 2 very different teams, but they are kind of 2 very different teams. I think that we are living more on the promise of what Austin is going to be at this championships, and that high is obviously incredibly high. Versus New York has kind of not necessarily shown their hand because they can obviously add a lot more, I think. But I do think that you have a bit more information on what New York could become championships.
Yeah. And Jack, obviously there's plenty of quadball talent on Washington's side, but it definitely takes a certain level of confidence to choose to play against Jay Stewart. So what do you think Chicago might be cooking in order to kind of try to slow him potentially down in a series?
Yeah, it's a potentially dangerous decision, and the Prow have been, or formerly the Intensity, have been burned before by going up against dynamic players from San Antonio. Jay Stewart is the latest in a long line of great players from that area, and is our second leading scorer in the league this season. So I think the Prow are going to look to throw some of their better defenders at Stewart. I think they can try Liam Zock. Zock has been a strong defensive presence, their most consistent tackler all season. But Stewart's going to be hard to keep up with. That's not a matchup I would envy.
Yeah, I really think it's going to come down somewhat to the beaters because I'm not sure if they have necessarily that one-on-one matchup in the quadball game that's going to be able to take Jay Stewart out of it. But that's more for our preview show this next week. We've got plenty more to talk about in the North Division this week. So we're going to move down to the next team who earned a spot at MLQ Championship, the 3rd seed, and that was Minneapolis taking down Rochester in 2 incredibly different games. Minneapolis absolutely rolled over Rochester in game one, 250-75, which I think somehow actually is a closer score than it felt on the pitch. But then the second game, 165-90, basically a back and forth affair until the flag runner catch got it. So I kind of want to focus on that game two, because I mean, it was clear Rochester was not ready for that game one, and Minneapolis absolutely rolled. So Nick, what do you think happened in that game two? Do you think it was more on the Minneapolis side of things or more on the Rochester making adjustment side of things?
I think it's more on the Rochester making adjustment side of things to an extent. I think I'll say I've said it all weekend. I think the coaching performance by Alyssa Giroso this weekend was a world-class coaching performance with a limited bench to continue to make the adjustments she made to put her players in successful spots in the game twos and late into game ones of these series was just absolutely astounding to watch. It's one of the best coaching performances I've seen in a long, long time. However, there's nothing harder than beating a team twice, right? And if you come out and you roll a team and you play in this fast transition style, and then you come out and they're all of a sudden not allowing those easy transition looks, you're definitely going to struggle a little bit to figure it out. And Minneapolis did figure it out, we will say that. But it is something that I think does give a little bit of hesitancy to Minneapolis's potential run to the quarterfinals.
Yeah, so Jack, I mean, we know that this Minneapolis team can play fast, and they showed it in that game one. And sometimes we do kind of run into those questions about, their half court game. So, kind of what adjustments do you think they could kind of make there? I mean, I think a lot of the looming shadow over a lot of the season is how important Emma Persons has been to this team's half court game in recent seasons.
Yeah, that's a problem they can't solve. A problem they can solve is getting OB back. His absence was felt just like it was last year at MLQ Championships for sure. But I think the beaters have made real strides, and the chasers for the Monarchs have always been able to play fast, been able to hit teams on the counter. But the beaters, I think, have really stepped up their pace this season. Nathan Podolsky, Joe Blanchard just bring that speed into the beater game that I think they've missed in past years. And I think it'll be a much smoother transition into championships now that they kind of have that experience playing the entire beater core at such a fast pace.
Yeah, Nick, I think one of the reasons that, Minneapolis has been able to kind of sustain this success in recent seasons is they seem to really have a next player up philosophy, because there's been plenty of times where they've been missing players to injuries or just missing players to absences. Last year, just HBB and Joe Goulet just weren't on the team. And it kind of feels like, even though it's a program largely built on basically one college program, a lot of players coming out of the Minnesota program with a couple pieces here and there elsewhere, that they've been able to keep this next player up mentality. Did you kind of see that in action a lot this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, totally. Meredith McDowell was prepared to put on a white headband at several points throughout this series. Meredith McDowell, primarily a beater, and a very, very solid one, does often get overshadowed by the Gracie Johnsons and April Grabners of the world, but does consistently hold it down for that University of Minnesota program. It's just a team built of players that are all willing to be quite honestly frank with each other and understand, like, every single huddle they were sitting in, everyone was getting in on the discussion, making points, pointing out shortcomings and highs and lows throughout that entire series. It's really, really impressive to see a team that trusts each other so much and so blatantly that everyone from 1 to 21 can say something and it's taken seriously all the way through.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways this is becoming a more and more unique franchise in this league. I mean, I think you could speak to League City kind of following this vein as well. But programs like, Chicago used to be the Ball State team. It's not anymore. It's so many people from so many programs. New York used to be very much like, kind of the NYU and kind of that area. And now it brings in so many teams from so many programs. And this Minneapolis team, so many of them played together club and, MLQ all season long. And I think it kind of shows in the way they're able to go about it. Jack, obviously, we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the next segment, but this is kind of the end of the road for Rochester this season. But Nick was kind of speaking to some of the highs. What did you like about what we saw from Rochester kind of being resilient throughout this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo the point about adjustments. I think bringing Joe Gokowski and Kip Halpour into the beater game was huge in game 2. I think, putting Adojo behind the hoops, letting them cook back there was a great decision. And this team has always been a team that unleashes shots from distance. So that's always fun to watch. And you're watching and you're just thinking, how could another one go in from that far out? So yeah, I mean, it's clearly something they work on. And yeah, I think it was cool to see how they responded and really improved in game 2.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a team that literally had 2 rostered beater, at least by beginning of season, position labels on the entire roster coming in. And I think it is what Nick was speaking to earlier. This program is so good at putting people in places to succeed. I mean, I've never seen Adojo play that effectively off ball, and I've watched plenty of Adojo. I mean, I coach against him all the time, and really was doing some work back there and making problems for all the opponents. And they found the right buttons to press in the beater game. As few options as they had, they found those buttons, and managed to hang around, make things interesting. Nick, I just want to talk about Minneapolis. We are going to talk about this more next week, but it is a stacked playing bracket, and I feel like we say that every year, and it just gets more stacked, which I think just speaks to the health of the league, and I think it's great to see. But I mean, the defending runners-up are down there. The 2021 and 2022 North Division champions are down there. A New Orleans team that was like 3 moments away from being like the number 2 seed in the South is down there, as well as KC, who finished above them and swept them. And that's not even, to count out Detroit and Charlotte, who's never failed to advance from the playing bracket. So do you think this Minneapolis team has what it takes? Do you have concerns?
I mean, both of those things can be true, right? I have plenty of concerns, but I do have confidence they can do what they're doing. I mean, we talk about seeking and how it is such a form-based game. There are very few seekers in the world who are more in form right now than Henry Bear Benson. Given that opportunity in game 2 to make the grab, it took 1 setup, maybe 1.5 setups to go get that grab. And that's only 2 weeks out. So I think really Charlotte might be the only team that they're not coming in with a 35-point lead over to start the game. And when you're going through a quarterfinal bracket or a path to the quarterfinal bracket where you're starting up on most teams 35-0, it makes it a lot easier to get out of that tough bracket.
Yeah, for sure. Jack, if I made you put money on it right now, would you lean Minneapolis being one of the 2 teams to get out or not being one of the 2 teams to get out?
I would. They have the harder side of the play-in bracket, I think, but I think their experience is really going to pay dividends in the play-in bracket. I think what they have to focus on, if I'm the Monarchs, is trying to not play the extra game and trying to take care of business against the teams that you should beat, so that you're not taking the longer road to the quarterfinals. But yeah, I would favor them to get out.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And I think what's really going to matter on that, as you said, kind of the quote unquote harder half of that bracket is being the team that gets to make it to the winner's bracket final, as it were. Because even if you lose it, you're going to be the fresh one coming to then the loser's bracket final. It is a gauntlet to get through that loser's bracket. We've seen it. I think we've seen League City make that run before. It's exhausting. And, it really is tough to kind of have it in you to play that last game to get across the finish line. So I think that does matter a lot, being the team who comes out. Be it Minneapolis, be it Charlotte, or be it Kansas City. So yeah, it should be fun to watch. But let's jump into our second interview with Minneapolis beater Meredith McDowell. Meredith, thanks so much for taking the time tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we haven't gotten to catch up with Minneapolis as much as we usually do. Obviously, Minneapolis has always been a show favorite. And we do love talking to you guys. So I'm going to kind of take it back through the whole season, kind of reset it. So obviously in recent years, it's been a division you guys have absolutely dominated. So you guys have that really tough series against Chicago. They come away with the sweep. Kind of talk to me about the setback of losing that series and kind of how the team rebounded from it, both on and off the field.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely kind of gave us a jump start into really kicking it into high gear for NDC. And I, as well as other teammates, can testify to the change in mindset and in the change of attitudes at practice. And I think, like, as much as it sucks to lose, it was something that the team needed to get prepared for NDC. And I think that we've, caught some momentum, and I think that we are setting ourselves up for future success.
Yeah, and it's great that you talked about that, because obviously that's kind of how it's felt in a lot of the last couple seasons. You guys breeze through so strong into MLQ Championship that, when that first kind of punch comes back, you guys sometimes are kind of struggling a little bit in that regard. You kind of heard us talking about you guys as kind of like a next player up mentality type team. And, we've seen a lot of it this season with some of your injuries, with some of your absences and some of your games. So talk to me about kind of what internally kind of makes that so possible for your team, be it the coaching, be it the overall team attitude, etc.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a combination of both. We have, in practices, there are definitely select players who do a lot of cross-positional training, and that has definitely set us up to be capable to, switch up those positions when we need to, when we're short on positions. I think it's also just a lot of attitude. And if you are a player who is ready to show up and train to be ready to be needed in any position on the pitch, it shows, and you prepare to then be utilized in that way. And because we have put time and effort into preparing for those instances where, because of injuries or because of just travel plans and logistics and whatever, if people are unavailable, we have trained to fill the need of, short players in different positions.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you guys have basically historically always had a playing coaching staff largely. Obviously, Emma out for this season and has been kind of helping as a non-playing coach. So kind of what has that kind of brought to the team, and how has that kind of helped things both in games and at practices?
Yeah, I'd say the most significant way that has affected things is when we are in like the competitive setting, because when you're a playing coach, it definitely takes your attention is very spread out, and to have personnel that have the sole focus of what are my lines, what are my team members needing, what adjustments do we need to make, I think is something that we've seen really be able to be run successfully this season, because Emma has had to spend so much time on the sideline. But during practices, I mean, Emma is there. Emma is doing the best that she possibly can, given the injury status. But having that direction in practice is, a similar result of just having that focused direction is really, really beneficial.
Yeah. So talking about the series from this weekend, you guys obviously, as you said, you came out prepared and you ran Rochester off the field in that first game. Game 2 goes a lot slower. They hang a lot tougher. We were all kind of, attributing it to the adjustments they made. But would you kind of agree? Did you guys feel like you had to kind of counterpunch their counterpunch? Or do you think maybe you guys just came out a little slow because of how comfortable game 1 was?
I don't think that we were slower. Our post game, game 1 huddle was, the conversation was we still have to work for game 2, and we can't just slide through this. Rochester is going to be looking at what we did and trying to problem solve and make those adjustments, and they came out and they did make those adjustments. And I think we took a second to then make counter adjustments, but once we did, especially on defense, there was a point where we had just been running 2-2, but then we switched to trees, and that made such a big difference because Rochester had made the adjustment to go and start shooting a lot more, and we saw that. And as soon if I recall correctly, it was HBB calling out that tree switch. And once we did that, I feel like we finally were like, okay, yeah, right, our game. And then we were able to pick it back up.
Awesome. So kind of looking ahead to championships, this is Minneapolis's first time in the play-in bracket since 2019, a very long time ago. Nick was still coaching. Kind of how are you guys kind of taking that mentality? Are you seeing it as like an opportunity to grow into the tournament? Is it kind of a disappointment? Kind of what's the team's overall kind of feelings about where you guys are at going to MLQ Championship?
Yeah. So this is definitely a different position than we've been in recently. But I think, I don't know, I'm kind of hoping that it'll be similar to Chicago in the sense that, like, this isn't the outcome that we wanted. Obviously, we would have loved to be at the top of our division. But there's more of a fire under everybody to kind of put in that work, to put in those extra training minutes and just get in the right mindset to go and hit the ground running at champs. So I think, yeah, the general consensus is like, we're going to have to earn it, and we're ready to do that.
Awesome. Well, we're looking forward to watching that. So it's always a pleasure to watch you guys play out there. And right from the jump, you guys are going to have a really fun game against Charlotte. And, I think it's going to be a really good tournament for you guys. So, Meredith, thanks so much for taking the time tonight. And we will see you at MLQ Champs.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All righty. So now with 3 spots from the North Division Championship decided, we have the run by Detroit to come through 2 series. First Cleveland and then Rochester to claim the final spot, the 12th and final spot at MLQ Championship. They couldn't have done it by much narrower margins. The Cleveland game 3, they were down 10 with Cleveland on next point wins and went on the 20-0 run they had to go on to get by them. The Rochester series did end up being a little bit more comfortable. Obviously, we've talked about the roster shortcomings from Rochester this week, but not to undersell that Detroit had to come out and play a strong series, and they did just that. But let's start with that Cleveland-Detroit series because it was a classic. 2 teams that really, really know each other well. Jack, what did you make of that series and kind of everything that kind of came down and was one of the, I'd say, 2 best series of the season, probably along with the Boston-Washington series we saw last week?
Yeah, I mean, it was an instant classic. There were so many punches and counter punches throughout the series, just both teams leaving everything on the field. I thought that for Detroit, Jack Levy came in and saved them. I think in game 2, just hit all the shots that they needed to fall. And same thing in game 3. I thought it was a really impressive performance. Detroit, I think, was struggling defensively to stop some of the drives that bigger players from Cleveland like Peter Brechting and Gabe Boris were bringing to the field. So that's an area of concern for Detroit for me. But I think that the shooting, the play around the hoops for the Innovators was strong, and they definitely figured it out as the series went on.
Nick, we've kind of been talking a lot, I think, over the last couple of weeks because we were talking about in the Cleveland-Rochester series as well that, especially, when you look at the bottom half of this division, maybe they don't have the top end players, but the strategy is so sound in the way these teams are going about things. What did you kind of see, as Jack was talking about, in some of the strategic adjustments being made in this series?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go see a masterclass in adjustments between games 1 and game 2 and game 2 and game 3, you have to watch this series. Whether it's Cleveland recognizing that Detroit was taking advantage of their lack of height around the hoops and adjusting to move some of those players who they have been playing at point defense to more of an around the hoops situation, to Detroit recognizing, hey, we can put our height around the hoops and catch passes right over Cleveland defenders because they're not stepping out to contest the pass. And then it's an easy dunk on that far side hoop. Or it's just you're continuing to see Ryan Sue play super high pressure looks against this Cleveland team, trapping from the corner. It's just a really, really exciting and super interesting series to watch how everyone does things. There were definitely some questionable strategic decisions on both sides, but overall, just the number of adjustments that are made, super, super fun to watch.
Yeah, and kind of coming into the series, I think a lot of people thought the difference might be in the beater game, where we've spoken so highly of the beater depth and skill on the Detroit side. It didn't necessarily really end up working out that way. I think the Cleveland beaters really held. Jack, what did you like out of this Cleveland beater core?
2 words: Sam Beeler. I take it as a point of pride to know most names in MLQ. For myself, Sam Beeler is a player that came out of nowhere for me. Not a name that I knew heading into the weekend, and she was absolutely outstanding. Just brought so much athleticism to the pitch. She was constantly hurdling dodgeballs. It was a joy to watch, and it made all the difference for Cleveland. They absolutely hung with Detroit in the beater game, and even had the advantage for large portions of this series. I think especially when Sam Beeler was on the field.
Yeah, I mean, she was a key part in that Game 3, continue to hold Detroit for a little bit, whether or not it was the case. I think in flag runner on pitch, she was the one really forcing the issue. We talk about sort of strategic miscues. Detroit made it very, very clear that their beaters for a long time were not leaving the seeker game. And we can talk about Detroit's seekers a little bit later, but the fact is that Cleveland's beaters weren't leaving from underneath their hoops to pressure or to force any issues. And when that Beeler-Oler combination came in, that changed super, super quick. And it forced Sue and Brodeur to come in and play in the quadball game a little bit more to prevent Cleveland from, frankly, just running away with it off the pitch. You're on mute, Ethan.
Yeah, for sure. And, we talked a lot about, Levy contributing for, in the quadball game for Detroit. But obviously for Cleveland to hang, they need to be getting some contributions as well. So what did you like in the quadball game from Cleveland, Jack?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have been more and more willing as the season goes on to push the pace. It's something that, I talked about with Joe Lombardi doing in the series against Rochester earlier this year. I think Corey Johnson brought a lot of that this series. So yeah, they've found their windows to hit a team on the counterattack, to run in transition, and I think that was a really promising development for Cleveland, and just a sign that they're gaining confidence as a program and trying new strategies out.
Nick, for this Detroit team, kind of as they go to championships, I think it's fair to say a lot of people will kind of consider them underdogs, kind of making that run. But what kind of do you like? What do you think they can kind of, bring as a strength going into that play-in bracket?
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about beater cores. I mean, they're littered throughout this entire lower bracket for sure. But they found something day 2, right? I think they really did, where this team tended to play Ryan and Ray so tightly together, and they weren't allowing them to sort of split apart and find what they were doing next. But to play Brooke Smiley a little bit more, I talked about it on the cast. I know I'm biased, but it was really a big transition to watch the Banis-Brooke Smiley pair be that second pair off the bench, and even give Brooke some run with Ryan and Ray some run with the Ryan Swansons and the David Banises. It helped to sort of even out the highs and lows of this beater core a little bit more. Plus, Game 3, I think they played 28 of 30 minutes or whatever at some point, right? You have a deep beater core if you are this Detroit team. You don't need to be fighting to sort of deal with that. And I think that while a lot of these beater cores in the lower bracket have the highs of highs, I think they might also have the lows of lows. And I think if this Detroit team sort of figures out something from that day 2 rotation they made against Rochester, they're not going to have the lows of lows that they sort of plagued them throughout the season.
Yeah, I mean, this is, one of the youngest teams in MLQ, a team that's very much still growing, I think, into every series. I believe 21 of their roster 30 players are 24 or younger. And, you kind of look at some of the other teams around the league. That's just not how a lot of these rosters shape up. You talked about, the Michigan core. I think we were giving a lot of credit to the Michigan State core that's kind of been a part of this team as well. But, even some of their players from, other parts of the country, like a Brooks Smiley. Jack, kind of what do you make of this team and kind of what they could do in that playing bracket?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have to figure out, what their best lines are. Where does their most efficient offense come from? I don't think they really know right now. I think they have, a lot of different weapons and players who can be utilized in very unique ways sometimes. Whether it's like Gwen Pratt's ball handling and ability to get loose balls and score around the hoops, whether it's Nick Love working behind the hoops and beating players one-on-one, Jack Levy's shots. They have these different weapons, and I still think they're struggling to put it all together because they're not going to have the same margin of error that they had against Cleveland. They're going to have to be much more efficient. They're going to have to make many fewer mistakes. So yeah, I think they have a chance to make a run if they can kind of clean up some of the mistakes and really figure out what their go-to options are.
Yeah. And, Nick, we were kind of talking about that earlier this week, off camera, because we were kind of talking about Levy's shot and what that offers the team. And, teams are going to have film. These teams are going to be prepped for Detroit, and they're going to want to take away that shot. And, Levy's not necessarily a player who's going to win a ton of one-on-ones against great point defenders. But if Levy can get a spot to take a shot, I mean, it's old school, quad ball right there. He's money on those shots. So what, as Jack was saying, kind of putting players in position to succeed, what kind of options can you do to kind of open up that shot a little bit better against elite point defenders, in just the entire way you run your offense? If you wanted to elaborate on that at all.
Oh man, Ethan, you're setting me up for one of my favorite topics, and that is screens. There were little screens, there were little handoffs. Levy was taking this shot, and to be fair, Kagan Madeline was also taking this too when Levy wasn't in. But it was particularly apparent that Levy was looking for these little screens and these little dribble handoffs, if you will, to get the ball in the shooting pocket and just take the shot. I think realistically, if you are a team that's looking to see how can I get people who have a great push shot open, go back and watch some of this Detroit film, because Cleveland and Rochester were both selling out to take it away, and Levy was still finding the moments. It's really about on-ball screens or even little beater taps, or understanding that your best shooter doesn't have to bring the ball down. Klay Thompson made a living in the Golden State Warriors, made a lot of money on just being able to get to his spot, catch the ball, and release that shot, right? If you're using other players to free up these special playmakers, they're going to get theirs.
Awesome. Anything else either you guys want to touch on? Anything about, Rochester's kind of day two attempt to hold them off? Or, should we move on to our last interview of the evening? Awesome. Then we will. We were just talking about him. We're going to bring in Detroit Innovators chaser, Jack Levy. Jack, thanks so much for taking the time tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the show.
Appreciate it. So, obviously Cleveland came out and gave you guys all you could handle in game one, ultimately winning game one of that series by a single goal. Did they, you didn't play, you're obviously nursing an injury, and kind of the ideal what probably would have been for you to not have to play all that many minutes. But obviously that didn't work out. Did Cleveland kind of come out and surprise you guys at all? Or do you think it was just kind of a slow start on your parts?
I mean, you got to give credit to Cleveland. They played phenomenally. We're talking about Sam Beeler, and yeah, she was destroying it out there. Really giving our beaters a tough time. I mean, we made the right adjustments in game two, but in game one, we were really caught off guard. We were hoping to kind of use a beater advantage as a way to rack up a lot of points, and it didn't work out. You also got to give credit to Cleveland Seeker. I mean, game three, I was sweating it on the sideline, just watching that alone time with Cleveland Seeker and the flag runner. And yeah, I mean, you got to give credit to them. They played phenomenally, and they could have totally taken that bid from us. So,
a lot of your more veteran players, play with these Cleveland players, they're more veteran players, throughout the season. There's a ton of familiarity within this matchup. We always love to say on the show that, familiarity breeds close games. Did you guys get a feel for that, these teams really did know what the other one was looking to do and kind of how to be prepared for that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think some of our players were quite familiar, just in the huddles, pointing out who's going to drive, what Cleveland was trying to do. I can tell you that as someone who isn't familiar with a lot of their players, I'm really noticing what they're trying to do on the sideline. So in game one, you see Cleveland scoring a lot of points from middle hoop shots. And in my head, that means, oh, that must mean that's working in practice. So, I'm seeing us come down the field. I'm seeing them in a 2-2. I also know in their series against Rochester, they played the triangle and won. And while those defenses are traditionally difficult to break, that's my favorite kind of defense to go up against because I need that middle open. And while it's great for stopping drives, that's not my game. And I know that's not my game. So, I'm kind of noticing that on the side. And while it's great to have those, individual player matchups and familiarity, it was also really great, just to be able to just look on the sideline and see what's working for them and how we could kind of use that against them in the next two games.
So yeah, you guys obviously lose that game one, and I mean, we all kind of had you guys penciled in as the 4 seed once we saw Rochester's roster and everything, and suddenly you are up against the wall. You can't lose any more games in that series, obviously. So what was kind of the vibe on the sideline in the huddle? Kind of what was the coaching staff kind of saying to you guys in between those games?
Yeah, I mean, at first it was really just take a deep breath and relax. I mean, it could have gone the wrong way, right? We could have left that game with, a bad attitude, not ready to compete in the next game. But I think, looking back at it, we did a good job analyzing what we did wrong, what we could have done better. And it really took the whole team coming together, talking as a group about what we were going to change. And we came out in game two with our strategy fine-tuned, ready to go. We knew where their weak points were on the defensive end, and I think we really took advantage of that. They definitely made the adjustments they needed to game three, and that's what made for such an exciting game three. But I think that's really what it takes. It's about reflecting on what went wrong in game one and trying to take advantage of that in the next game.
We've kind of done a lot of hypothesizing on this show this season about the difference between some of the younger teams in the league and some of the older teams in the league, specifically in these close, down to the wire type games. And we've talked about some, in regard to San Antonio, another team that's kind of built out of a college program that's really only just done a lot of winning lately. And, a lot of your players from a Michigan program that's really done a lot of winning lately. And also players who have only ever played in a, meta where this set score was the meta. So, how did you feel like your team kind of responded to those situations and kind of what was going on down the stretch in that game three?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of pressure, not really, playing in such a tight game. And, while we had a lot of tight games at Michigan this year, we were not in a position where it was flag catch or goal to win. We never had that scenario. While we did have in-range games and some really tight flag runners on pitch, we never had a game where it was like our beaters had to choose. And, it's funny. I talk to Ryan about this all the time. I'm like, if you're in the game and it's next goal wins and the other team's got a really great seeker, what are you doing? And, we go through that all the time. And the first time I ever was exposed to that was watching MLQ champs last year in that New York Austin game 2, where it just felt like both seekers could catch the flag runner. And for the first time it's happening to us, right? I mean, young college students who've never really been at that level. So, just getting, watching those games, learning what those really, really talented players are doing in those scenarios really helps. Slowing the quad ball down on offense to give our seeker time versus in the next goal win scenario, making sure our beaters are coming in just for a quick goal, right? To just try and prevent the Cleveland seeker from catching. I mean, granted, I think we got a little lucky with a legal swat in that game. But it's really just watching that film, learning from the best players in the league, and taking advantage of that, because that was really our first experience being in one of those neck and neck games.
So obviously it's been a little while since you guys actively qualified for MLQ. You guys did make it in 2021, but the whole North Division did qualify that year. So kind of what does that mean for the program? Again, a young program, kind of a rebuilding program in some ways, to kind of get over that hurdle and successfully qualify for MLQ Championship.
Yeah, I mean, it means a lot. A lot of our team, despite being in college for 3 years, has never played an MLQ championship. And we're really excited. This is a different kind of qualification, you know. The North Division has 6 teams, and for that reason, it's a much bigger deal to be that 4th team, right? We really had to fight our way to get to that spot. I know something that was been bothering me for over a year was that nail biter with Toronto last season. And I'm like, I couldn't let it happen 2 years in a row, right? And, you know, for that reason, it meant a lot. I think the loss last year made it mean so much more this year. And it really was a bounce back. And I'm glad we were able to come out and perform and get that bid.
You obviously are someone who, you know, clearly studies the game, clearly has a lot of thoughts on the strategy of the game. You guys are gonna have a first round matchup with the New Orleans Curse, a very veteran team, a very strategic team, and I think it's gonna be a really fun look. You know, you're very young, kind of up and coming beater core against such a veteran and talented beater core. I'm sure you guys haven't had a ton of time to start your scouting yet. You guys only qualified 2 days ago, but are you guys looking forward to that matchup?
Oh yeah, I mean, we've been thinking about this one for a while. We've been talking about it a bit on the drive home. I mean, Josh Mansfield has a positive plus minus, and even though it's 1, right, that might seem like a little, but when you play Austin in your division, that's a lot, and they're the 4th seed. I mean, close games against San Antonio, close games against Kansas City, and close games against League City. I mean, that's a team that's been really tested in some close game scenarios, so we're really looking forward to them. We also know that they're going to probably be a drive-heavy team, and I play the opposite, right? I'm a shooting-heavy team, or I'm a shooting-heavy player. So it's going to be an interesting matchup there. I wouldn't expect them to come out in a hoop zone. I haven't really seen that much from them this season, but as you're saying on the podcast, or as you're saying on the show, they might change up that defense based on what they were seeing this weekend. So, you know, we're going to be ready for those scenarios. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jack, thanks so much for taking the time tonight. Best of luck. We're looking forward to that matchup. It's going to be a fun one, and we'll see you at MLQ Championship.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, that's going to do it for another episode of MLQ Replay. We do have one last episode to come next week when we will be previewing MLQ Championship in Des Moines, only 11 days from now. It's kind of hard to believe how quickly it's coming. I think it's going to be a great one. I think we have crazy parity, both in the playing bracket and in what some of these upper bracket matchups are going to look like. And I think there's a lot of doubt about who's going to win this championship. And I think it's going to be fun to watch it all play out. You know, we want to really quickly, while we're, you know, closing up the North Division season, shout out Visit South Bend and, you know, where we hosted North Division Championship, and also Newton Park, the location of it. Also, of course, want to shout out, you know, our production team, Harry Clark, doing all the work behind the scenes. Patreon, one last shout out for that. We still do have Cuts with Knees running. We still do have the breakdown running. So check that all out for a little bit more strategic breakdown before MLQ Championship. But yeah, that'll do it for tonight. For myself, for Nick, for Jack, we want to thank you for watching. To all 3 of our guests for being incredible interviews. We appreciate that as well. We'll see you next week for a preview, and we'll see you in 11 days in Des Moines, Iowa for MLQ Championship 2023. Thanks for watching.